I'd like to share a personal story related to, I guess, change and leadership and strategy. Back when I was at American Express, I had a fairly large team. At some point, it got as large as 100 people, so it was a pretty large undertaking. And I was in the head of what they called the learning and development area, a national training group. And we did have a few people outside the country, but for the most part, it was a U.S. based learning and development group. And I was one of those middle managers at that point in time that had to deal with this new thing, this new entity called the internet, and the implications of the internet in terms of how business is conducted. So I actually did my due diligence. I did my 1031, and it was, you know, sold through the ranks of leadership, and they saw where I believed, we could take, whether it be virtual training or computer-based training or all of the things that were associated with that. Of course, there were people in the executive organization that saw this as a way of cutting costs, which in a lot of ways was not true, but they did see it that way. And eventually, we were able to find the way to blend these things all together, traditional versus online. But the real challenge was I had in my head, this perfect, analyzed 3 year plan, and it just, I was so proud of myself. And I realized when I looked back on my organization, the people that I led, the only people who truly understood what I was talking about was basically me and nobody else. As analytical as I could be and as well thought through as I thought my plans were, it really wasn't something that was easily understandable. Because what was I suggesting? I was suggesting a huge sea change, going from an extreme direction of one side into an extreme direction of the other side. So I had to really take the time to think through the dance of change and the stages of concern and all those kinds of things. And I did use a very intricate meeting strategy where I had organizational meetings twice a year. I had which I ran with a project team, volunteers from the organization, and I would basically have them build the exercises and that we would implement through our training. I used them as my translators. I had weekly management team meetings with my direct report team, to make sure that we were all on the same page and, updating each other on status. I did monthly conference calls where I had the not my direct report team, but a level lower than that, run the calls, take on the agenda, field the questions, and I basically presented myself as a resource in that regard. So that was a part of my strategy. I want to speak specifically to those biannual meetings. Every 6 months, I would run a meeting, and my purpose of that was to not necessarily inform about strategy so much as it was to engage in strategy. And I can give you I'm going to give you an overview about, how I handled that. What I realized was that it really dealing with people strictly on an analytical basis was not going to work. I had to hit them emotional. And the first thing I needed to kind of get across was this idea of being a part of a system. Training people back in the 70s and 80s would be, hey, they liked me in front of the room, and that means it was a good training. But I was being held accountable for the result of the training and development. Did behaviors change in the sales force? Did the behaviors change with supervisors? Did it change in the service arms? Are the metrics changing as a result of what we were doing. Think about the metrics hierarchy that we talked about in an earlier segment. What was the behavior change required in order to make the drivers, what was the drivers of behavior change, and what were the behaviors required to make the goals happen? And that was something that I was held accountable for. So systems thinking was one of those things I had to introduce from that tactical view. I took them to a meeting, and I did my first opening remarks around this idea of the story of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Meriwether Lewis happened to be, a hero of mine, fascinating character on so many levels. But we all know him for being Thomas Jefferson's assistant, and Jefferson wanted him to be the guy to find the path to the Pacific Ocean from St. Louis, and Meriwether Lewis and his team really had nothing to start with. They didn't know what they were going to expect. What was the Native American that they would meet along the way? Were they friendly? Were they not friendly? What about plants, poisonous plants? What about animal life, wildlife? What about mountains and rivers? They didn't have that. They were embarking on a journey, and they didn't have the map. They were creating the map, and that was really what made their story and history so impressive. And I had to instill on my team that I felt like Meriwether Lewis. That was me. And together, we're going to build this map. We're going to make it happen. At the same time, I told another story. I had just finished reading a biography on Jackie Robinson, another hero. And, what he had to confront in terms of, getting through the race barrier, and the things that he put on his shoulders, and the way he performed as a person, as an athlete, all of the things that he did. In a way, he was a Meriwether Lewis as well, and that he didn't have, he didn't have a map either. So he was sort of on his own. So that was sort of my theme in that first meeting, and I will never forget this. One of the employees came over to me at a break. Big guy, tall guy, and he was sort of like had tears in his eyes. He kind of had welled up, and he came over and he spoke to me, and he said, "Bob, I am totally on board. I see exactly what you're saying. When you told that Jackie Robinson story, I said, I know what I need to do to help you." And I learned something that day. I learned that this is the way to get to people. You have to touch them with your leadership. So every meeting, I figured, let me come up with some way that I was feeling and present it in sort of an allegory or a metaphor of some form. This whole idea of natural systems. One of the things that was really complicated for us was how exactly do you line up things, measurement hierarchies, when the things you're doing may not be actually measurable, at least not in our current level of sophistication. Well, I did, speak, I pulled a biblical story of the prophet Amos, who was basically, if you recall the story, he was, from the skies above, was told that he would be a prophet and a leader for his people, and he was not really up to the task himself. He wasn't confident in himself, and he said, "I'm not sure I can handle this." And of course, the voice from above said, "No, you're going to do this. Sorry, you have no choice." Basically, I'm paraphrasing. So he was the reluctant prophet, and in a way, I was kind of feeling that way too. As the what puts me in the situation? A company of 100,000 people. Why am I the guy who is being asked to make some of these dramatic changes in the organization? So I kind of felt like that, and I think my team felt like that too. While I was there, I also, because we were up in New Hampshire, I also invited somebody from the weather station up there to come and speak with us, and I said, "Explain to me how you predict the weather." Because we're trying to do that too. We're in the prediction game right here. And what we learned from this very smart guy was, in a way, it's judgment. There is some subjectivity. There's some qualitative nature to a measurement hierarchy. It's based on your experience, and we were still at the early stages of our experience at that point. We would eventually get the quantitative aspects of it, but it had to start somewhere. And I thought that was an extremely helpful starting point for us. I took them. I had the fortune of working for a country that was, excuse me, a company that was in the travel business. So I got to travel. We could basically get great rates at different places. So we took them out to Sedona, and I had a Native American shaman there who was again really bright guy, and he basically take your time, one step at a time. It starts with a blade of grass. Things don't grow and complete overnight, and that was a very interesting time. At some point, we became good at what we were doing, and we continually needed to evolve. So we kind of started getting the measurement, and we were getting really good at our project planning and all those kinds of things. But then, things started getting more and more sophisticated, and the whole idea of the workspace that people were in, not just the computer screen workspace, but the workspace that they were sitting in their cubes, that became our training room, because we were more and more getting out of the training room and into self-help tools where people could, or guides or things that they could use right at their desktop. We would be the ones that would bed instructions into their computer programs and on the service desks and things like that. That was considered training. So what do we do? What platforms could we build, and what could we do to influence the workspace? And the perfect analogy for me there was the inventor. We became the inventor. We became Edison. We had to put things out there that were relevant. And one of the things that was great about Edison, what made him great, is he wasn't just an inventor. He invented things if he knew that people would see them useful. He didn't just invent, off the top of his head. He made sure that they were going to be useful first. And that was something I really wanted to slam home, on my team, is let's be useful before we start putting a heck of a lot of time into our developing new tools and strategies. And that was an easy thing for us to do, because we could test things on ourselves. If we can create our own hothouses, if you will. At some point, we got so good. When we got into, if you can believe this, this is the time frame. We had just gone through the Asian flu with the fall of the Thai baht, and the real first global problem that affected countries all around the world, and companies all around the world. That was a really tough time. So the fall of the Thai baht and the Asian flu was huge, followed shortly thereafter by the burst of the dot-coms, and that created some havoc as well. And leaders started to see there were some aspects of running a business, they were out of control. Of course, 9/11 happened shortly after that. So we were getting kind of slammed with these large macro level events, and the company was going through some tremendous downsizing. We were losing service people, salespeople. Up to this point in my tenure, senior management was protecting my headcount. I didn't really lose anybody, which is miraculous that they would keep a training headcount stable and not a sales headcount. But we were basically doing things because of our Thomas Edison and our Lewis and Clark type mentalities. We were definitely doing things that were making a direct impact on the company. And, while that was all well and good, it actually started to make me nervous, because I started to feel that our team was thinking that we already had figured it all out, and that never happens. That never happens. So my next meeting, I kind of brought up the Sleeping Beauty analogy, and that there are people around us who are pretty ticked off that their groups are getting laid off, and why is this group not? There are things around us that are going to start to kind of point fingers at us, and we're going to need to be held more and more accountable. What happened with Sleeping Beauty was, because of the how tiring it is to deal with, external negativity. In her case, with the Maleficent, the witch, but with us it was other factors. It really, what happens is when you're in pain is you have to rest. And we needed to go through that rest period and rethink ourselves until the inspiration, in her case, Prince Charming. In our case, it would have to be something else. I also told the story of the civilization of the Mississippian Empire, which was prevalent in North America at that time. Cahokia was a city right near St. Louis. We got to actually, I took the team out to to Cahokia to see it. It was really a wonderful sight. This was a civilization that it really disappeared over time, and the reason it disappeared was they became complacent. I mean, they started to overuse their resources. I guess, just like we are today, they polluted their environment and they had to scatter. So the city of Cahokia, the civilization of the Mississippians, scattered. But at their height, Cahokia as a city was as large as Philadelphia was in the 1800s. So it was a fairly large society that they had there. At this meeting, because of the idea of complacency and things like that, I did something very odd. I actually conducted a fire walk, and I mean literally conducted a fire walk where I had to contact the local fire department and get permission from the city of St. Louis, and I didn't tell my team I was doing this. But we laid the sod down in the courtyard of the hotel we were staying at, and we burned logs and made the fire and spread it out. And I will tell you, it was, for many people, a very scary experience. We did a couple of things that were scarier than the firewalk, but it was a scary experience for people, and they were extremely nervous that they were away from home and needed to take this exercise. And what I made fairly clear to them was that I really had no interest whatsoever in teaching them how to walk on fire. Not that I knew how to, but that wasn't the point. The point is, I needed to know what they would do when they are faced with their fires, because we had fires that were coming. I saw it. I saw it happening. We needed to go we were so good at the 3-year plan, but now the idea of the 3-year plan our breakthrough strategy had to be broken into much smaller implements. We needed to show change over and over and over quickly. So my firewalk was the Prince Charming. It was the wake-up call that says we have to continually learn, how to move forward. And the fact that they didn't feel expert actually was a good thing. I continued on. I told stories like the wonderful story of Annie Sullivan and Helen Keller at a future meeting. This, to me, the idea of knowledge management, there's no better story than Helen Keller, in that she not only didn't know much about the world in her state of being blind and deaf, but in a lot of ways, the world was unknowable to her. And the whole concept of knowledge, when she was at the water pump with Annie Sullivan, that was one of the most incredible things that ever happened in history of humankind, where Helen Keller was able to kind of piece the feeling of water with the word called water. Didn't even know what a word was at that point. And just that great breakthrough that she made to connect physical world and language, and where she took that. That's what knowledge management was all about, and that was the world that we needed to get involved in, was managing knowledge. So think about the leader that Helen Keller became, and think about where she started from, and it's really quite an amazing story. I also took them into Wind Cave, to kind of make them feel a little bit about what Helen Keller might have felt, where they shut down the lights and made it pitch black, and it was sort of a scary thing for some people, but it made the point. The idea of transformation was another huge issue for us, in that as we start to make breakthroughs and understand that it's not just about today's practices but tomorrow's practices, continuing transformation as a way of life, and continuing to be compassionate about multiple points of view. I had I ran an exercise where I had the people who were running the ranch that we were staying at come in and sort of I primed them, but they ask us for help managing their financials, and we spent all day working on the financials for them. And that was kind of a fun thing watching my team, get involved with something that wasn't really their expertise. They weren't accountants; they were trainers. And what I did the following day was I had a community meeting where I invited everybody in the world who had some either pros or cons about the expansion of the ranch and things like that. And they did nothing but argue and pick on my team and throw things at them. And my team started getting very, very defensive. And it was all done on purpose. And the reason was because when you're going through transformation, a lot of, they got to experience firsthand that there was a need to understand others before you present. I mean, they knew this, but they had never felt it with that amount of intensity. At that meeting, I also talked about another favorite guy of mine, Will Rogers, and how, his ability to evolve was just amazing. So, guy started out as a cowboy roper, moves to be a vaudeville star, becomes a radio sensation, a radio host. Eventually becomes the advisor to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And, after he finishes with that, he turns himself into an airplane pilot. And you may recall the story how, that's how he ended up dying was there was a crash up in Alaska that he was a part of that with Wiley Post. And that's it. That the analogy of Will Rogers and his ability to continue to transform himself over time and be successful at everything he ever did, right? The fact that he died on top of the world is not an accident, in my opinion. So when we're done, we're gonna be done on the top of the world, and then I felt strongly about that. I had a staff meeting just on the idea of acceleration and how things are going to get faster and faster and faster in terms of change. And by the way, you guys know this. I took them to Skip Barber Racing School. I told them the story of Jackie Stewart and how Stewart was somebody who absolutely knew how to slow himself down, slow the world down while he's traveling at speed. 350 miles an hour through curbs. And at the Skip Barber Racing School, they made us do the skip pads and the crazy driving and all that kind of stuff. They forced us to be out of control so that we could, figure out how to slow ourselves down and correct ourselves. Towards the end, when I knew this position was eventually going to be, we couldn't get away with no headcounts losses forever. So I knew at some point, I saw the writing on the wall that we were eventually going to get absorbed and combined and re-engineered and all that. And my direct report, who I reported to, changed from where I was to a more of a centralized world, and that was just expected. So my goal, what I perceived to be the end, was to start to make sure that everybody in my organization knew that they were leaders. I handled this in a sort of a peculiar way. While Abe Lincoln is clearly one of my heroes, and on so many levels, and I said that at the group in a couple of seconds, but instead what I did was I talked about his successor, Andrew Johnson, and who was probably one of the worst leaders of all time. And I sort of went through Johnson's life story and the pivotal times in his life where making a move one way versus another turned from being, a very successful leader to being somebody who had a terrible impact, on the future of our country. And I thought that was interesting. So they got to see those moments. Will Rogers took advantage of his moments to the better. Andrew Johnson did the opposite and actually hurt things long term. I finished up my time here. We had gone. The company started to go through some major cuts, and I had to figure out a way to really demonstrate once and for all what the new world that we were a part of and what we'd be going. So I decided to make my last staff meeting a virtual meeting. We did a 3-day conference over the internet. And we did that with we used the same format that we would have used if it was a live meeting. We had, I sent boxes to people's homes with materials for exercises. I had opening remarks done via um, telescreen so people could see me. We had breakout groups through conference call numbers so that people could do work on their own. I had a T-shirt for the meeting. I put in lunch vouchers so people, when they went to lunch, they can have lunch on the department. The T-shirts were kind of funny. We actually even did a pool party, where somebody put his camera facing his pool, and he was toasting us from his home, and it was really a wonderful experience. And my final analogy that I used was really around the evolution of man, and one of my favorite movies, 2001: A Space Odyssey, where man evolved just through continually understanding the mind, where he went from the moonwalker, the ape, who learned how to use tools so that he could store food, and then create the idea of having free time, and free time brings thought. And that's handled so wonderfully in the movie, where Moonwalker throws his bone up in the air and it turns into a spaceship. And the implication there is, once you know how to think, the difference between Moonwalker and a space trip to Mars, really the distinction between those two things is not that large. So it's really, it's use your mind, it's be analytical, it's continue to think forward. And Space Odyssey, the whole idea of the mind going from the benefits of thinking, and the spaceman Dave Bowman, to actually humanity's next phase of evolution, which was to become pure thought, which you would see in the later movies as well. So I wanted to share that with you. It was a to me, I think all of you should be thinking about leadership from an analytical and an emotional perspective. There are a lot of things that you probably have in your mind but don't know how to necessarily translate it into others. I think the art of storytelling is something that you should certainly consider. Think about stories that you're living. Think about stories that you have passion about, and connect those stories to circumstances in your own life, and people will follow you. They absolutely will follow you. So thank you for listening to my story, and I look forward to future discussions with you.